Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us. Well, is treating real estate as an investment draining housing supply and pushing long-term renters to the brink of homelessness? Or is it providing added income for people struggling with high mortgages or even helping out with retirement? What does the government need to do about it? The province has announced major new rules to limit short-term rentals. Is that a step in the right direction? We're spending the hour discussing those questions, asking you, how has real estate as an investment impacted you? I'm Michelle Eliot. Welcome to BC Today. Thanks for joining us on CBC Radio 1 and live streaming on CBC Gem, cbc.ca/BC, and on CBC Vancouver's YouTube page. Last week, the provincial government announced the Short-Term Rental Accommodations Act, limiting what can become a short-term rental on platforms like Airbnb to units that are located within a host's principal residence or an added suite on that same property. So no separate condos or homes can be listed. The proposed legislation also adds fines for illegal suites and requirements for more data from short-term rental platforms. The legislation is aimed at freeing up short-term rental units for the long-term rental market. And the province says it's targeting property owners with multiple units listed. But some Airbnb hosts say they're stunned by the new regulations and fear their investment is about to take a hit. Here's CBC's John Hernandez reporting with voices from a short-term rental owner, as well as Housing Minister Ravi Kahlon and SFU's Director of the City Program, Andy Yan.
I do not think this is the right way to do it, and it's going to have a lot of unintended consequences.
Victoria's Deborah Sheets fears her investment is going to cost her big. Earlier this year, she spent more than $400,000 on a micro suite she lists on Airbnb.
I've put all my savings into my unit. I'm following all the rules, paying all the taxes, buying the business license.
Sheets says it supplements her retirement income, but she fears that revenue stream will dry up. On Monday, the province outlined impending rules to regulate short-term rentals. Hosts will only be allowed to list their primary residence.
Ultimately, our goal is to get more housing back into the housing market for people to be able to rent.
The province says the goal is to target owners who list multiple units, but those who bank on just one feel like they're innocent bystanders.
It's going to decrease the value of our property, and we're not going to be able to find anyone who wants to rent it at a price, a long-term rental that would be able to afford the cost to cover our mortgage.
These are units that were originally designed and intended for young and new households.
This housing policy expert says the short-term rental market has given investors unrealistic expectations.
This is something that I think is really a busted bet on real estate, on residential real estate, and that residential real estate is not commercial property.
And renters have paid the price. Research from McGill University shows short-term rentals in markets like Victoria and Vancouver have brought vacancy rates down by a full percent, while increasing rents by about $50 a month.
Which sounds like a small amount, but they ultimately have cumulative effects for renters who are already challenged in this province.
Still, small-scale operators contend they're filling a need.
We charge half the rates that hotels charge, about on average, I would say. There are a lot of people operating short-term rentals without following the laws, and those need to be cracked down on. Maybe they need to restrict the number of short-term rentals, but to treat us all as if we're one uniform entity just isn't the case.
The new rules are expected to roll out in stages next year, starting May 1st. John Hernandez, CBC News, Vancouver.
Well, the province's steps to limit short-term rentals is making waves, but how much of an impact will it have on renters and on property owners? Where do you fall in that debate? We want to hear from you this hour. What impact has real estate as an investment had on you? And what impact has it had on housing in BC? You can call us on the open line, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, on your cell phone, pound 690. And you can also email your thoughts to bctoday@cbc.ca. And to understand more about the picture of who makes up investors in BC, we have been joined now by Statistics Canada senior analyst Joshua Gordon, and he's with me in our studio. Hello, Joshua.
Nice to be here.
Thank you very much for joining us. Now, you and your colleague, Joni Fontaine, have released data on investors, and this is the first time this year.
Yeah, so we published that earlier this year in February for the 2020 reference year. So that's for kind of the start of 2020. And we looked at that time, 5 provinces. So BC, Manitoba, Ontario, New Brunswick, and Nova Scotia. And we've added data for PEI recently for 2021. And so we cover those provinces and we look at kind of the share of owners that are investors, and then what are the nature of the properties that they own and what properties are deemed to be investment properties and those properties that aren't investment properties.
What did you find in BC? What is the share of owners who are investors?
Yeah, so in BC we found that around a quarter of all owners in BC were deemed investors, and we define investors as those who own a property that is not used as their principal residence. So that would mean that somebody who owns a secondary property is an investor, including in cases sometimes where they might use it as a recreational property, they'd still be considered an investor. That was just the definition that we found.
So they're not necessarily renting it out.
That's right. Okay. So we found that definition was the one that was most used in the literature, and so we stuck with that, and you can kind of then look at specific types of investors within that. But that also will cover larger scale landlords who own multiple properties and rent them out, people who are speculating, a whole range of situations. But that's the basic definition. And so about a quarter of owners were investors in BC, which is a bit higher than Manitoba and Ontario, just a few percentage points higher, but a bit lower than New Brunswick and Nova Scotia and PEI. Which had rates around 30%. But their situation was a bit unique because there was a fair number of kind of properties where there was a vacant land plot next to the property, and so that gets counted as investors. So
I see.
It's a bit unique, but anyhow, BC has a rate that's more or less in line with most of the other provinces.
Right, just behind Ontario, which seems
right.
to be what generally how we see BC and Ontario housing markets. And in terms of the nature of the properties, what did you notice were the most common investor type properties? Yeah,
so condominium apartments were the most frequent or typical investment property type. So around 36-37% of all condominium apartments in BC were investment properties, according to our data.
Does that seem high to you?
So we don't make a determination. I mean, we're providing the data for the first time. If you look at newer condominiums in cities like Vancouver and Kelowna and Victoria, the rate of investment properties is near around 50% or half.
Okay, wow.
Yeah. And so that's higher than among kind of single detached houses or kind of those types of houses, semi-detached houses, which is about half of that rate in terms of the overall share, which is around 17%.
Okay.
So it's definitely lower amongst single detached houses and those types of units and higher in condos.
Okay, I hear you. So let's go through those numbers again. Among houses in BC, about 17% are investment properties. Investment properties.
Yeah.
36 to 37% of all condos in BC are investment properties. But if you look at Vancouver and Victoria, you're looking at more 50%?
Those are for new condos. So in fact, if you look at the overall rate, it's around a third too. It's around 35%.
I see.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's similar, but it's with the newer condos that people have found that interesting.
Seem to have that eye on it. And I suppose you're not able to make any kinds of conclusions like what we heard from that piece from John Hernandez, this study out of McGill saying short-term rentals have fueled this interest in condos.
Yeah, we wouldn't be able to distinguish whether those are being rented out on Airbnb, for instance. Right. We can provide kind of the share of properties that fall into that status, the causal effect on rents and prices and things of that sort. We have not done an analysis of.
Sure. Still, the data is really interesting. And, something that we've discussed here in BC over many years is the rate of foreign ownership and large companies owning more property. You talked about some large companies already, but what did your research find?
So, if I'm recalling correctly, around 7% of all condominium apartments were owned by non-residents that of the investment properties. So that's that's a share that's larger than in other comparable cities. So there is a higher rate of non-resident ownership in some of the larger BC municipalities. That's for sure. In terms of kind of business ownership, that is more in line with other areas. I think it's slightly lower than in Toronto, for instance.
Okay.
I'd have to check on the specific numbers, but
Sure.
yeah.
So 7% are not residents of the province?
No, not residents of the country.
Of the country.
So
okay.
Out of country. We also looked at kind of out of province owners, and that is a smaller share of condominiums, but they own a significant portion of houses in areas such as along the Alberta-BC border. We found a fairly high rate, and somewhat higher rates than in most places in the Okanagan.
Joshua Gordon is with me from Stats Canada, and we're digging into the numbers that tell the story of real estate as investment in BC. How much of it is an investment property? How much of the condos and the properties that you see around are investment properties? And who makes up what is an investor in BC? Now, we've gone through a lot of numbers. Can you paint us a picture of who is typically is that investment buyer or owner?
Sure. So investors tend to be older. We can say that. A majority of investors in BC were over 55. And a fairly small proportion of investors were under 35, around 5 to 7% kind of. So it's not as typical, which kind of comports with the fact that it takes a while to accumulate.
Right.
They tended to earn higher incomes, as you might expect, around twice the incomes of on an individual basis of people who just owned a property, and those individuals earned about twice as much as non-homeowners. So they make more money. There's interestingly, so not a big difference in terms of the share of women and men amongst investors. A slightly higher proportion of investors who own kind of 3 or more properties, larger scale, tend to be men, but not a big difference there. One thing I should say is BC is quite unique amongst the provinces in having a high rate of what we called investor occupants. And so this is where and so this is distinct from investors, but kind of related, where someone will own only a single property, but that property has multiple dwellings or units. And so in those cases, we called those investor occupants because you could potentially rent out that property, right? So, and in certain cases, you might have 2 or 3 properties or units on that property.
Okay.
And so BC has around 10% of all owners fall into that category of an investor occupant, where there's multiple units on the property, some of which may be rented. Yeah.
Right, and you also didn't break down whether those renters would be long-term or short-term.
No, correct.
And finally, Joshua, why did Stats Canada want to look into this?
Well, as you sort of mentioned, there's been a lot of interest in the topic in terms of the impact of investors and investment on real estate, and the job of Statistics Canada is to clarify those discussions with better data. We don't take stances in the debates, but we provide the data to allow for better analysis.
Fair enough. Thank you so much for going through that with us today.
Not a problem. Thanks for having me on.
Joshua Gordon, a senior analyst with Statistics Canada. And our question for you this hour on BC Today is, what impact has seeing real estate as an investment had on you? What impact has it had on housing in BC? You can call us 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733. You can hit pound 690 on your cell phone. And Jeremy is calling us now up first in Smithers. Hi there.
Yeah, good afternoon. How are you?
I am well. Pretty cold up there today?
It is, but that's all right.
Well, thanks very much for calling, Jeremy. What are your thoughts on real estate as an investment?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. I have been, I'll just be honest, in real estate for over 20 years. Been out for the last few years. I also have a bunch of rentals. And I wanted to say that I have been watching carefully up in our town, our area, how the government has basically taken over. By that I mean they're the only ones building rental units. They started off with like townhouse type, and they built some apartments, and then they built many, many units. In fact, I can only think of a handful of private people that took their own money, built a unit, and put in a renter.
And is that a positive or a negative in your view?
I think what it does, it's a negative because it's not market driven. So I look at always the details. They have 35-year interest-free BC government money to build it. And I was just at an AGM from one of our local nonprofits that is really involved with housing with over 90 units. And it clearly shows that they don't even take enough rent to pay the interest-free money they get from the government, let alone the maintenance and repair on these units. So what it says clearly is that there is no market for people, investors, to purchase real estate as an investment.
Okay. And is that, I have a follow-up question for you on that, but is that what you're observing as a realtor? No, are people asking you about, or not, I guess, about purchasing to rent out?
Right. So many people ask all the time, and I have to be honest with them, and I right away take them straight to the numbers. I get them to look at the numbers. What is the cost? What is the rent? And what's the true cost? Obviously, the taxes and all these other government extra taxes, and you're taxed on your income and all of that. And if you do the numbers, rarely ever can I find any real estate available that is truly an investment, that actually gives you a return more than 2%.
And let me ask you then, Jeremy, if government is playing a bigger role in purchasing and running, or I guess using nonprofits perhaps to run a rental apartment, isn't that a good thing? Isn't that what people have been calling for in order to free up units for long-term renters?
I'm not saying that they can't be in the market, but because they're in the market, nobody else gets into the market. So they're the only ones in the market. And if that's what we as a society think is a good idea, which I totally disagree with, then that's exactly what's happening. And nobody is going to compete because they cannot compete. So if we have to call it what it is, which highly subsidized government housing. Let's just call it what it is. At least then everybody understands it.
Really good to hear from you, and that perspective as well. I imagine people have different perspectives on that subsidized government housing. I so appreciate hearing your voice today, Jeremy. Thanks so much for the call from Smithers.
You're welcome.
Stay warm. And that's Jeremy in Smithers. Annette is calling us now in Vancouver. Hi, Annette. What impact has seeing real estate as an investment had on you and on housing in BC?
Hello. Yes, I had always been brought up with the idea that I was going to be buying my own place. And due to the storms of life, I was unable to do that, even though I was very hardworking, had to use money to just live. So I'm fortunate that I have subsidized housing at this time. But I look around my Cole Harbour neighborhood and see several 26-story towers and that over the last 17 years have only ever had 8 lights on. And one of those units has year-round Christmas decorations absolutely filling the balcony with big snowman and a Santa Claus pole. And then inside there are lights on, but just for the Christmas village.
Right. So not necessarily for someone who's actually living in it.
Evidently not.
Yeah.
I walk by it pretty much every day, and it's been like that for several years now.
Wow. What do you think that means then for the housing market, for people who want to rent?
Well, it ties into the other thing I've noticed. I have a couple of neighbors here, more than 2, who own properties outside of this building, and they find it more profitable to invest a little bit in living here, pay the rent, and then still rent out these properties as a source of income. I don't know that that's a viable model for people to be able to buy and own their own places and pay their own mortgages. It just doesn't seem right. I'd like to see us decommodify housing altogether, and go with more of a common good in terms of what we hold together. The common property. There's been a proposal by Floyd Marinescu of UBI Works and other people. They've been talking about that.
And yourself, do you rent in Cole Harbour, Annette?
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
But it's only because I can only afford it because it's subsidized.
Right. Okay, so there you have it, right? Like we had someone earlier say highly subsidized government housing isn't a good thing. And you're saying you're able to stay in your apartment because it's subsidized. So it's interesting to hear.
It's not subsidized by the government. It's a nonprofit. It gets no government money. It does get help from they have for the land that it was built on, but they don't get any other funding.
Okay.
So it is actually quite a good model.
Annette, good to hear from you as well. So good to hear these different perspectives. Thanks so much for your call.
Thank you.
You take care there in Cole Harbour. And we are asking you on the open line, what impact has real estate investment had on you? What about on housing in BC? And we've just heard some interesting statistics about just who owns real estate for investment. And now let's hear some more information about renters. Researchers from UBC found that BC has the highest eviction rate in the country at 10%, compared to the national average of 5.9%. Another area where BC was leading was that 85% of those evictions were no fault. And that means tenants were evicted because the landlords were selling or demolishing or converting the property. In comparison, the national average for those no fault evictions was 65%. And while you call us on the open line, we're going to have a discussion on this as well. Our numbers again, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, pound 690 on your cell phone. Asking you what impact has seeing real estate as an investment had on you? What about on housing in BC? Joining us now is Tenant and Resource Advisory Center lawyer and tenant advocate Robert Patterson. Hi, Robert.
Hi there. Thanks for having me.
You're not the actor. Thanks so much for being back here on the show. And let's talk about that eviction rate. What's driving those numbers? I mentioned a little bit there in terms of no fault and what landlords are doing, but what's behind the increase?
For sure. I think there are two big things at play here. First off, I think one of the reasons you see a higher rate of no-fault evictions in particular than other parts of the province is that we don't have adequate protections in our provincial tenancy laws to make sure it's actually hard to evict tenants. Specifically for no-fault evictions for landlord use, where landlords claiming that they're going to move in and evicting a tenant for that reason, we just don't have enough protection in that situation. Our entire eviction process in BC really puts tenants in a very challenging position. They are the ones who, for example, have to be the one to start a legal proceeding. To evict a tenant, all the landlord needs to do is print a piece of paper and hand it to the tenant. The tenant is the one that actually has to take it to the residential tenancy branch, pay the filing fee, and begin the legal process. A landlord can also show up at these hearings and simply claim, verbally, yes, I'm going to move in or my child's going to move in. And there's not really an established baseline in our rules for what they have to do to really prove that. So what we see a lot of is tenants losing their homes on the landlord's word, essentially, with no proof of any actual intention to move in. Then that unit ends up back on the market, 2 months later at double the rent. And a tenant does have a right to some compensation in that case, but that compensation goes away very quickly. They burn through it when they're paying a higher rental rate, which, they're lucky to get something in their area usually. And what the UBC study shows is that if you get evicted, you're usually moving out of your community. You're probably moving out of your city. In an attempt to find better housing or affordable housing rather, and it's not going to be better. It's almost certainly going to be less suited to your needs, smaller, fewer amenities, further from the essential services that people connect with. So that's one part. We don't have those protections, but I think there's underlying all of this is a profit motive, right? In BC, we only regulate rents during tenancies. So there's effectively a huge financial incentive rather, for a landlord to evict tenants, to kick them out so the next tenant can be brought in at a higher rent. And while that pressure, that sort of incentive is there, it's very tempting for a lot of landlords. And whether we see that too from larger players, where they sort of like a stated intention is to, the term used is churning buildings. What that really means is mass evicting people over a period of time to make sure that the rents gained from that building rises.
I'll go to you after our news update here with Robert Zimmerman as well, Robert. But perhaps I'll ask you now because you're going along this thought, and so just to follow up on that, we often hear from landlords who say it's nearly impossible for them to evict a tenant who has posed problems for them. Do you think that that is why more landlords are turning to these short-term rentals that now the province is trying to limit?
I mean, I've certainly heard that from landlords, but in general, I think what really drives the short-term rental market is greater profitability and control. Landlords who want to operate in a very short-term rental space can charge more effectively on a per nightly basis. They can have more of the Residential Tenancy Act provincial laws that don't apply to those tenancies, so they can exert more control over those situations. And they see it ultimately as a more profitable activity. I'm not sure, it's because of the rules that protect tenants that the landlords aren't going that way. And I would say, I think the implication from landlords there, right, is that if only we made it easier to evict people, we would turn our units from short-term rentals into long-term rentals. Well, we're already leading the nation in evictions. So what more do we need to do? How much easier do we need to make it to evict tenants until suddenly it's it's profitable enough, essentially?
I suppose they would say that it's when a problem arises.
Well, when a problem arises, landlords certainly have rights to end tenancies. I will say, in terms of the residential tenancy branch, consistency of decision-making certainly is a problem. Timeliness has been a problem as well, like waiting to get through the system. That has been improved recently with further investment. We're seeing those hearing wait times come down. But I think a lot of the time, sometimes landlords, don't understand the rules. They try and go through the process without sort of getting legal assistance or informing themselves of what their rights are when they're dealing with a problem tenant. We have incredibly draconian rules in BC for evictions, especially around things like non-payment, or if a tenant is breaking a term of their agreement or putting people at risk. They can lose their housing in very short order if a landlord sort of is following the proper steps. And at the same time, tenants are entitled to a certain amount of procedural fairness, so that they have the right to, stop the process if they want to say, I actually haven't done these things, or I actually have paid my rent, for example. And the danger, of course, is if you streamline the process enough, or too much rather, you end up, the people don't have an adequate way to fight against these evictions. They lose their housing without having been properly heard. I mean, I think that already happens a lot in our system for a number of different reasons. And we shouldn't be increasing the number of people that are losing their homes in that way, simply to try and see if some landlords will take their short-term rentals off the market.
We'll talk more about that and what is needed then when it comes to that housing supply for long-term rentals. My guest is Robert Patterson, a lawyer and tenant advocate with the Tenant Resource and Advisory Center. We're going to go back to Robert and more of your calls as well as we ask you what impact has seeing real estate as an investment had on you? What about on housing in BC? And in about 10 minutes from now as well, we'll be joined by Mark Ting, personal finance expert, to talk about, is it still worth it? Do people still see investing in homes worth it? Christina writes us, your guest said that about 50% of newer condos are owned by investors. This was in Vancouver and Victoria. Could the reason for this be that the rest of us just no longer can afford buying homes, even small condos? Thank you very much for that question, Christina. We'll put that to Mark Ting coming up as well. Right now, let's pause for a CBC News update, and here's Robert Zimmerman.
Good afternoon. 4 First Nations have signed a partnership deal with a forestry company in what's being called a landmark agreement. The 4 Nations will acquire a 34% interest from Western Forest Products worth almost $36 million. The partnership will manage about 900,000 cubic meters of timber. Investigators are looking for answers after a boating mishap yesterday off Wreck Beach here in Vancouver that led to a man's death. The Coast Guard was alerted to a boat taking on water at about 1:30 yesterday afternoon. By the time the first crews arrived, they found a man unresponsive in the water, and attempts to revive him failed. And the first major snowfall of the season could blanket higher elevations of Vancouver Island with up to 10 centimeters. Environment Canada has posted special weather statements for inland, northern and eastern parts of Vancouver Island. Meanwhile, in the interior, up to 15 centimeters of snow is expected on sections of the Coquihalla and Highway 3. And now taking a look at the forecast on the north coast, sunny and windy this afternoon with a high of 6, highs reaching -6 and mainly cloudy in the Peace. In the central interior, including Prince George, sunny with a high of -4, highs from 0 to 7 and mainly cloudy in the West Kootenay, snow in the East Kootenay. In the southern interior, including Kelowna, a chance of showers with a high of 7. And for Metro Vancouver, Greater Victoria, and the Fraser Valley, more rain this afternoon with highs around 8 degrees. I'll have more local news at the top of the hour. Now back to Michelle with BC Today.
I heard you say a high of 0 to 7
High
in the
of 0
Kootenays.
in the Kootenays.
Yeah.
Hang on. From 0 to 7.
Yeah,
That's correct.
that's cold.
That is cold. But -6 in the Peace.
Yeah, -6 up in the Peace.
Yes,
I know.
And some snow.
Yes,
in
some snow
parts.
on the Coquihalla as well.
Yeah.
It's winter. I know I was cold, and we're nowhere near those temperatures, but I had to bring my shawl
Yes.
to the newsroom.
It's cold. It's cold out there. We
Yes,
don't like
Rob.
the cold. We do not like the cold. October to what is it? June essentially is kind of crappy, right?
Yeah, yeah. And then in June, we complain about it being too hot. So what do you do?
Yeah.
Rob, thanks so much.
You bet.
Robert Zimmerman in the CBC Vancouver newsroom. Welcome back. You're with BC Today here on CBC. Thanks so much for joining us on radio and live streaming as well. And this hour, we are talking about real estate as an investment in our province. This in light of new rules around short-term rentals that the province has just announced that would start rolling in around May of next year. And so we are asking you, what impact has seeing real estate as an investment had on you? And what impact has it had on housing in BC? Our phone numbers again, 1-800-825-5950, 604-669-3733, pound 690 on your cell phone. You can email us to, and Maureen wrote, I'm happy to hear this discussion. My spouse and I purchased a home with a suite for the purpose of renting it out long-term to a tenant in Nanaimo. We strongly support the new rules as we rented for 2 years in Vancouver before moving to our home and found that investors make really lousy landlords who are notoriously MIA for tenants and fail to recognize that a rental is someone's home. We've carefully vetted our current tenant, checking references and being very clear with requirements. We have a great tenant and feel that investors should not consider a rental property unless they live on site or at least are prepared to really show up for those tenants on short notice. And we have a great tenant, and that's what she writes as well. We have a terrible time as renters with this in Vancouver, as our kids both in North Vancouver and Victoria have as well. Renters really don't hold the cards in this province. It strongly favors owners and landlords. This has to change to resolve this housing crisis. And Martin writes, for 30 years, we've been self-employed and always have been. We've had good years, slow years, and bad years. One of our main ways to help support our semi-retirement will be renting out our one rental property, rather. It's a long-term rental. We've worked hard and purposefully schemed our retirement with this as a main leg of our plan. Thank you so much, Martin and Maureen, for your emails. Really good to hear from you. bctoday@cbc.ca is our email address. And Robert Patterson is with me from the Tenant Resource and Advisory Center. So what are your thoughts then on investing in real estate, on people who purchase real estate for the purpose of renting out either long-term or short-term? What impact is it having?
It's a very broad, interesting question. What I'd say is, in terms of like the patterns that we've seen recently, there are, the landscape is shifting. So, for example, like the interesting number I looked at recently, in 1996, real estate investment trusts, so these organizations that are set up to hold real estate and can effectively sell shares of themselves as a pure investment vehicle, owned 0% of rental housing stock across the country. They now own 20 to 30% of it. So what we sort of start to see in terms of like people individually investing in housing, like obviously that has been an attractive investment for a long time, and has gotten attractive as sort of rents have risen. It's also becoming attractive to these institutional players. And when you see large scale real estate investment trusts investing, it does kind of change the dynamic of sort of who the landlord is. So, someone who's renting out their basement suite to a tenant, in that situation, we can talk about how likely that owner probably is forced into that situation because they don't have the money to buy the house outright, right? We have seen the ballooning real estate costs and the ballooning costs of owning of any kind of housing mean that people are sort of forced into these situations. And really that can often becomes a complex interpersonal relationship. We hear from a lot of tenants who have great relationships. And we hear from a lot where, a personal relationship goes sour and that suddenly threatens their home and their housing and the security they feel to be able to have a place to live, right? In terms of when you have a larger organization, something like a real estate investment trust that's going around and generally not building new buildings, but buying up existing stock and trying to get a bigger stranglehold on the market, you see instead sort of carefully calculated strategies to maximize the return on investment. I think for every landlord, even a landlord that is doing their best to be a good landlord and a good person to their tenant, right? In the back of their mind, there's always the knowledge that this is an investment on which they want to make money, but they can make the choice, right, to accept less rent than they possibly could, to cut tenants slack where they can. Something like a real estate investment trust is not only far less likely to do that than any other kind of landlord. They're probably not even really, there's a great incentive on their board of directors, for example, to deliver consistent profits for their shareholders. So you take the regular profit motivation of housing and you turn it into overdrive for these organizations. So that's one huge risk. I think as well, when we talk about sort of what kind of housing we're building and how to get back to a place where people we can sort of realize an actual human right to housing in Canada. The provincial government in Canada has stated that's something that something they recognize, a human right to housing. The federal housing advocate has stated that's essentially something that we need to do in this country is to take steps to realize that. The last time we had anything close to that, we were so much further ahead in terms of public investment in housing. When the taps were turned off from investing in public housing in the early 90s, since then we have seen a slow and steady slide into increasing unaffordability as once the government stopped providing sort of a baseline of housing amount of social public and sort of affordable housing, the market takes over and the market only seeks profit. So that's a primary reason why rents are spiking up so much consistently over that period of time.
You've done a good job there of, pardon me, I'm sorry to jump in, Robert. I just want to put some breaking news to you. This morning, tensions between renters and their landlords did reach a high point at a rally that was held by renters. And this was outside the buildings of Cressy Development Group. Now, that runs several rental buildings in the Lower Mainland. And renters are demanding immediate action because they say they live in unsafe units because of neglect, safety and fire risks, as well as pest and mold infestations. So this morning, they held a rally, and here's a moment when renters entered the Cressy offices and confronted the organization.
Is this Cressy?
Hi. Hi, we're delegates for 4 apartments owned by Cressy.
I'm so sorry, I cannot be one of the delegates. I only work.
I've been trying to speak to you since August 30th about mold in my apartment. You wanted flooding my apartment and nothing has been done. Nothing has been done.
Yeah, we delivered you a letter.
We're speaking to your building manager who's harassing and abusing us.
Listen, we have been working to repair anything that we're aware of. So
would you like to see the mold in my apartment?
There are countless repairs.
Again,
sir.
This is guys, this is like we had one letter submitted. We have followed up on all those issues.
You never got back to us.
We'll look at every unit and we'll come up with a plan to fix it. We'll do that today, okay?
Let's do that.
Maintenance met.
That's not enough. We have a letter of demands. We want all of these demands met. We don't just want the maintenance issues looked at. We want an emergency contact. That's required by the RTA.
That's give you an emergency contact. I thought we already had one. If we don't, we'll get you one immediately, okay?
Okay, so that was the moment a group of renters this morning entered the offices of their landlords, Cressy Development, seeking accountability for repairs and other issues they say have been neglected. Now, in a statement to the CBC, Cressy says they take the situation, quote, very seriously. They say they have started immediate assessments and necessary repairs. They have relocated one tenant to a newer building, rental building downtown, and are committed to addressing the tenant's concerns. And when you heard someone refer to the RTA there, that's the Residential Tenancy Agreement. Robert Patterson, I heard someone being interviewed, an advocate being interviewed on the early edition this morning, who said, renters can sometimes be reticent to bring up those issues because of the squeeze in the market. There's not much else to go. So when we talk about the housing market, more units being taken out of long-term rents to be put on short-term, what does that mean then? Outside of this particular situation we've just covered, we have the statement there, but in general, what does that lack, the market, that lack in the market mean for renters who have these kinds of complaints?
For sure. I mean, absolutely. Every unit that could be occupied by someone as their home that is taken out of that for whatever reason makes it that much more challenging for people who are trying to find something. And absolutely, I think so many tenants are worried about bringing forward issues to their landlords because they realize, tenants have rights under the act to ask for repairs, to ask for landlords to stop harassing them, or to prevent others from in the building, for example, from harassing them or interfering with them. But they're so often afraid to exercise those rights, knowing that we have inadequate protections against eviction and against retaliation in our laws and at the residential tenancy branch, knowing that raising an issue with the landlord can put a target on your back. I think what we started to see, sort of a movement growing, and it's starting to pick up speed here in BC, inspired by some groups, larger movements in Ontario, is tenants getting together, organizing together so they have strength in numbers when going to their landlords and bringing demands. Sort of a tenant unionization movement that has been brought forward by people like Vancouver Tenants Union, Victoria Tenants Action Group, that are working to get tenants to speak to their neighbors, to see if they have common interests that they can advance by going to the landlord and saying, you can ignore us perhaps individually when we make our written requests for repairs, but if we're gonna get together and work together to hold you accountable to the rules and the law. So not one person is getting a target on their back, but everyone acting together can act from a greater position of strength. Ultimately, I think when we talk about a lot of these problems with housing, especially with rental housing, but also the general housing market, tenant voices are so often, or just generally people who don't own property, that's tenants, the people who are unhoused, their voices often are not heard. They don't get a seat at the table, oftentimes because they can't pay for lobbyists to represent them. They can't, don't have time out of their days to go to consultation meetings or go down to City Hall and speak in favor, for example, of rental housing rezoning or other protections for redevelopment. But by getting together and starting to organize, they can get that seat at the table. They can make their voices heard, and to solve a lot of these problems, a lot of these problem with the housing market, we know what the answer is.
Okay.
Because we know what it has looked like when we had a healthier housing market. And that is better tenant protections, that is much greater government and public investment in housing and all kinds of non-market housing, nonprofit housing, co-op housing, social housing, everything like that.
Robert.
But in order for that to happen, there needs to be political will. And tenants, by organizing and using their power together, can get that.
Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
Robert Patterson is with the Tenants Resource Advisory Council, a lawyer and tenant advocate there. And as you heard from him, we also heard from some owners, a real estate a realtor earlier on, one of our callers as well. Still taking your calls on the open line. And right now we are joined by Mark Ting, who's a partner with Foundation Wealth and the On the Coast personal finance columnist, to talk now about the challenges faced by people who do choose to invest in real estate and whether it has been worth it. Still taking your calls on what impact real estate as an investment has had on you. Mark, thanks so much for joining us.
Hello.
Can you give us a sense of what people, what is the thinking for people who are looking at purchasing, it looks like most often a condo, to rent it out? We heard from someone earlier saying this is something that's part of my retirement. I've planned for it. So what are people asking you when they're considering about becoming a real estate investor?
Yeah, it's pretty tough out there. So if you're looking at it from a cash flow perspective, if you buy a condo at today's rates and you rent it out, even if you get market rate right now, they really have to factor in what's going to happen several years down the road. Because what will happen is they'll get market rent, which may make their property cash flow, likely not, unless they have a really big down payment. And then every year, if your costs go up higher than your rent increases, then you're going to have to sort of justify that and make those mental calculations. So from a cash flow perspective, a lot of people are shying away from it in today's rates and today's market, and the environment is just not worth it. But some people really just love real estate, and they're sort of looking at it long term, and they're thinking of the capital appreciation, because of course there's two sides to a real estate investment. There's the cash flow portion,
right,
as well as the appreciation portion. But so unless you really are on the appreciation side and you can afford to subsidize your rental property, the cash flows just won't be there in the Lower Mainland.
And what about when there is legislation like this Short-Term Rental Accommodations Act that comes in that limits what can be listed as an Airbnb or a Vrbo, for example? What does that mean for someone who has done exactly what you've been talking about?
Yeah, so I mean, I was talking about long-term just earlier,
sure.
But I guess you would have to almost assume the rules are going to change because they've changed so much in the last couple of years, and you got to assume that they're going to be more restrictive. So if you're a renter, or sorry, if you're an investor and you're planning on Airbnb and that's the only way you can make the numbers work, I'd be very hesitant to doing that, because it just in my mind, it's being restrictive already. And then you'll likely be forced in a situation where you might have to sell, or you might have to do something else. But it'll likely be sell, because you cannot, if you did your pro forma, your business plan based on Airbnb rental revenue, and then you have to go long term, it's just not going to work. So you're likely going to have to sell, and that property probably will not go to a renter. It probably will not go to another investor who will rent it out. It'll probably be sold to somebody who's going to occupy it. So again, it's going to displace. Well, I guess it wouldn't replace a long-term renter, but it won't go back on the rental market.
I see.
That's what I figure will happen.
So, earlier, it's interesting, we heard Andy Yan from this city program at SFU being quoted there. He said that investors may have unrealistic expectations built on short-term rentals, and in essence, is this, a busted bet. Do you think perhaps have people put too much stock in short-term rentals, given what we are told is that it has increased over recent years?
Yeah, I mean, it is a busted bet, but it probably wasn't their busted bet. It was like at the time when they made those decisions, the rules were completely different and they could make it work. But because the rules have changed, the government's changed, they put in these new policies. Now it's a busted bet. And exactly. So what are those people left with? They're likely going to sell. And as I mentioned before, they're going to sell to probably an end user, which is good for first-time home buyers and people who want to occupy it. But I don't think it's going to really. I don't think there's going to be a tsunami of new rental supply going on the market because of these Airbnbs. It'll probably help a little bit, but it's going to be probably underwhelming.
Let's take some calls with Mark Ting, who is an advisor with Foundation Wealth and is the On the Coast personal finance columnist. And let's take some calls from you now. Paul is joining in Vancouver. What impact has real estate as an investment had on you, Paul?
Hi there. Am I on?
You sure are. Go ahead.
Oh, fantastic. Well, my wife and I are renters in Vancouver and have been rent-evicted many, many times, which is, I think, the case for any renter in Vancouver. But we were lucky enough, after many years of saving, because we're both in the arts and don't make a whole lot of money, to be able to buy a cottage on the Sunshine Coast in 2020 that had been run as an Airbnb for the previous 10 years. So we purchased it to use it as our second family home where we can take our daughter to enjoy the nature as opposed to living in the heart of the city. And we've been renting it out. We have a local property manager over on the coast taking care of the place. We pay her a very, very livable wage to do so. And now with the new restrictions, what we were assured when we purchased the property has been taken away. Right. And on another note, it's a cottage. It's wood heat. There's not a lot of insulation. It's not really viable. It's not a viable place for long-term dwelling. Yet now we cannot rent it anymore.
Are you paying? Can I ask, Paul? Are you paying the speculation tax on that, or is that exempt?
We're paying. We pay everything that has to be paid. Okay. We are as above board as it could possibly be. We've never had a complaint.
I'm sure you are. It's a good question, though, and you're basically, something that we've heard as well, which is people who are purchasing a place that is something they would use themselves, and then when they're not, they are renting it out. Is that right? On short-term rentals?
Exactly. Yeah. Like there was an article on the CBC website yesterday about a family in Chemainus that had a little cottage on their site that they're not the primary residents of that cottage because it's a separate place.
Right.
And and they said the only result of this was that they were going to, of course, it was going to be financially hardship for them.
Yeah, I'm gonna jump in because
it's not going to become a rental ever.
I hear you.
Soon.
I only have about 4 minutes left with Mark, so I want to make sure he gets to answer because I think you would like to just have any kind of advice or suggestion from him. What are your thoughts on that scenario, Mark? I'm sure it's common.
Yeah, that's why it's frustrating. So it's frustrating when people make their decisions based on a certain set of rules and then they change. In this situation, it's not going to be rented out. So it's actually taking supply out because now other people cannot use that who want to use Airbnb. And to be honest, a lot of people love Airbnb. Like when I go on vacation, or lots of Vancouver people from Vancouver, when we go away, we love using Airbnb, but we just don't like it in our own community because we feel like it's taking away from the rental stock. And it possibly could be, but in this situation, I don't think it would. So I think this is like a collateral damage of this policy.
And where does this leave then someone like Paul?
Underground, and that's what we're seeing. It like people will like maybe he'll only be able to rent it to friends and family, which really reduces his pool. Or that's what happens when things get overly legislated and there's more penalties and stuff. People find ways to circumvent things. And Paul, he's up front. He likes to play by the rules, and he might not do that. But I'm saying there's a whole group of people that likely will, and not that they're doing anything like crazy wrong. They just feel like they're sort of painted in a corner, and that's how they justify it.
The province says this is just one part, right, of its attempt to bring back long-term rental housing. But what I'll do is I'll squeeze in Ian in North Vancouver, who's been waiting so patiently. I have about a minute, Ian, but go ahead.
The rent control appears to have a number of significant downsides. The reason for rent control, I think, is that it's very politically popular that politicians can say we're protecting you from the big landlord. However, the consequence of that is that it creates two classes of renters. One is those who are already in a rent-controlled building, and the others who've got to try and find the market on the place on the open market. And the rentals are very significantly different, which anchors the people in rent-controlled buildings. They can't move. They can't go to another job somewhere else because they lose the benefit that they have. So the government is trying to force the private sector to subsidize rentals for people who can't afford them, rather than the government doing the subsidy themselves and leaving it into the free market. Also, the legislation and the residential tenancy board is failing everybody. They're failing the tenants and they're failing the renters as well. And what I would suggest is that you go to a privatized system where you actually use an Airbnb system to run long-term rentals.
Ian, thank you very much for that. I have about 40 seconds left. Mark, I guess what do you see as the way forward in about 15 seconds here?
I don't actually. I think what's going to happen is a lot of the mom and pop type landlords are going to disappear. I see them giving up right now. It's very toxic right now between renters and landlords. You could be a greatest landlord in the world, but you're just going to be, painted with the same brush, and same with great tenants. And that bigger landlords are going to take over.
That's another conversation, isn't it? Mark, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
You can hear Mark Ting Thursday on the Coast. That's it for us today. We're taking your Halloween photos. BC Today at cbc.ca.